Welcome to Critical Thinking Video 3, Models of Critical Thinking. The first model that we're going to start off with is the Description, Analysis, Evaluation model from Hiddleston. This is a really useful model as it looks at the different questions we might ask and how they will lead us to different forms of understanding. Whenever we're investigating a topic or issue, we often start with description, things like asking what, when, who and where. These are really important questions and they're definitely things that we need to detail. However, we need to limit our description to just enough so people can understand what we're talking about, because we want to move towards analysis where we ask questions like why and how. Built upon our analysis, we then head towards evaluation, where we ask what next, so what, and what if. Let's look at an example of this. So I have my description. What? A care plan. Where? In a hospital. When? Last Tuesday. And who? For an elderly patient. So this is the basis of my essay. And by answering these descriptive questions, people know what I'm talking about. However, this must be a limited part of the essay because I need to move into analysis. Here, I can ask things like, for what purpose? Well, to help assess the needs and identify the outcomes. How do I do this? Well, through assessing, planning, implementing and evaluating. Why do I do care planning? Well, it's a systematic approach. It also helps me consider the psychology, sociology, biology, and so on. So these are some of the types of questions that we'll ask when we're analysing. And analysis lets us examine the detail. We break things up and we try to see how everything fits together and how those relationships form between the different ideas we're investigating. So, if we take our analysis and move towards evaluation, it's at this point that we're starting to get towards conclusions and recommendations. So we ask questions like, what next? Well, I need to relate this to my own practice and develop a care plan potentially. Or I can ask questions like, so what? Relate how care planning can help further develop patient-centred care maybe. Or we can consider things like what if? Well, what if we didn't care plan? And we could consider some of the many consequences of poor care planning and what that would lead to. These are the kinds of questions that help lead towards our recommendations or conclusions, dependent on the essay we're writing. The other model I want to look at is Bloom's Taxonomy, and how I have framed it is through the skills of criticality. Our baseline is knowledge, knowing stuff, and we do this by defining, locating, describing, naming and listing things. Knowledge is so important, but it's also very easy to demonstrate. I could do that myself right now. I could go into my bookshelf and pull off a nursing textbook and I could read bits of it and repeat it back to you. However, you wouldn't want me looking after you in a hospital or any other care setting. Knowledge alone is important, but it's not enough. Next up we have comprehension. We can think of this as our understanding. When we demonstrate understanding, it's at that point we can begin to interpret what we have read. We use our own words through paraphrasing, and we can begin to discuss. It's at this point that I'd fall down with my repeating information back. At that point, I can't really paraphrase, interpret or discuss because I don't understand. So, in any situation, it's more important to demonstrate understanding or comprehension than it is to demonstrate knowledge. We then have application. Application is where we start to take what we've read and we use it, apply it and solve. Quite often this is in a different context. So you might read about something in a book or learn about it in a lecture and then take that into the real world, work or placement. We've looked at analysis already in Hiddleston's model. Analysis is us breaking down ideas into their constituent bits and looking at them in detail. A really good example of this that we've all probably done at some point is the purchase of a mobile phone. A very cursory analysis would see us look at different phones and choose which is the one we end up buying. But actually, a more detailed analysis would require us to go into more depth. Not just look which is the better screen, but ask more questions. Which is the higher pixel density ratio? Which is the better viewing angle? Which has the ability to produce more colours? That would truly be an in-depth analysis, and it's that kind of thing you need to do as you move through the levels of study at university. When we're analysing, we can compare and contrast, categorise and examine things in more detail. Next up, we have synthesis. We can also think of this as creation. This is when we begin to rearrange and integrate, reorganise and create new stuff, tying together different sources to build our own argument. And finally, we have evaluation. And that's when we're leading towards our conclusion and our recommendations. It's at that point that we test, conclude, judge, defend and critique. Evaluation generally leads towards the answer, or at least the thing we're going to argue is the most convincing. In general, the higher the skills, the more marks. So when you're writing, you want to focus on getting more analysis, synthesis and evaluation than you do knowledge, comprehension and application. That's not to say that you should only do analysis, synthesis and evaluation. Without some description and comprehension and application, people won't know what you're talking about. So you do need to get that balance right. So how do you apply this in your studies? Well, critical writing does not mean write about everything you know about. We often have to be very selective and handpick the evidence and points we want to talk about. It requires us to understand what is being asked of you. This is so important because quite often students tend to answer a question that hasn't been asked. So really understand your assignment criteria and make sure you're doing what it's asking you to do. You need to have a good understanding of the topic. Before you can even begin to write or plan your essay, you should do as much reading as you can, as this will help inform the direction your assignment will go in. You don't want to do this while you're writing. This can lead to a very unstructured essay. You also need to know your focus and selections. You can't write about everything in that topic area, so what are the main arguments and which ones are you going to choose and include in your assessment? We also need to make sure we're producing something that's well structured. We might have some of the best and most innovative ideas, but if our writing is messy, it's inaccessible and it will not get as many marks. And finally, try to write simply. Quite often people just try to sound academic, and that makes their writing very, very dense and hard to interpret. You can actually write very simply and still write complicated ideas. Try to keep your sentences neat and not too long. A common mistake is people think they're at university and so their sentences and languages should also be very complicated. This is a fallacy. The higher marks and the better assessments are always well written, written simply, but still engage with complicated ideas. You should also try to avoid colloquialisms, everyday speech. If there's something that people probably won't understand unless they grew up around you, try to avoid writing that into your essays. That's very bad practice and is not academic. So let's look at how we might start to piece these skills together in an assessment. So it starts off quite often with understanding. We try to get to grips with the key points and arguments. We can then move to analyse those, so we're trying to see how they fit together and look at them in detail. We might begin to compare the similarities and differences, compare and contrast the different sources. We might then move towards synthesis, bringing together those ideas to build our argument. We come to evaluation to assess the sources that we've engaged with and whether we're going to write them into our essay. Which ones might we choose not to include? We then need to use application when we're trying to look at what we've learned in relation to the question and thinking of justifying, drawing conclusions and identifying any implications or recommendations that we need to write into our essay. You'll notice this is very far from the neat structure of my earlier slide. It tends to be very messy, but embrace that process and always make sure you are organising your ideas well, something covered in the later videos. Another way of looking at this is to also realise that all of these things don't necessarily fall into the essay. For example, our aspects of understanding and analysis might come into play in our reading, our synthesis and comparison in our thinking and planning, and of course other skills when we're evidencing all of this in our writing. Before ending this video, I want to give you an activity. Have a look at an old piece of work that you've done and try to identify when you've been descriptive, analytical and or evaluative. This is a really useful reflective activity to let you think about which areas you may need to work on. It would be particularly useful to focus on an essay where you've particularly been asked to be more critical and try to see where you have been overly descriptive.